Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the event, Rationalism, Social Justice, and Critical Theory with Helen Pluckrose and Gus Lyn-Piluso. This event is hosted by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, your community for science and secularism. My name is Rohit Mohindra, and I'm the Toronto branch manager and board member for CFIC. And I will be your moderator for this event. CFIC is Canada's only national nonprofit with the mission of promoting and educating the public on critical thinking, science, and secularism. We help people make decisions based on evidence, rational thinking, and compassion. Therefore, in line with our mission statement is to hold events like these, where we provide a venue for subject matter experts, intellects, and free thinkers to engage with you. In order to put on events like these, we heavily rely on donations and memberships. So please consider this as you enjoy the talk, which I'm very excited about. So here's a little bit about the speakers, and judging by the number of attendees, I think there'll be no stranger to you at all. The first is Helen Pluckrose, who is a liberal, political, and cultural writer and speaker. She is the editor of Areo Magazine and the author of many popular essays on postmodernism, critical theory, liberalism, secularism, and feminism. Her academic writing focuses on late medieval and early modern religious writing by and for women. During her studies, Helen became concerned with the impact of postmodernism and critical theory on academia, liberalism, and social justice movements. And joining her, we've got Gus Lyn-Piluso, who has been a professor for over 30 years, teaching students to think critically, rationally, and to engage the world as active, ethical citizens. He has been interested in Deweyan pragmatism for years and sees truth not as something received, but arrived at through the communal process of free inquiry, whereby ideas are tested and challenged in real-life situations. He currently teaches a transdisciplinary big history of the cosmos, Earth, life, and humanity, and the emergence of complexity using the best available empirical evidence and scholarly methods. He has a background in social justice education, critical pedagogy, and has been an activist working to reform the critical justice system. So the agenda will be as follows. Gus will interview Helen for about an hour or so. He is going to play the role of neutral interviewer / devil's advocate. We will then go to an audience Q&A for the last half hour. During the talk, at any time, you can use the chat window to write your question, and we will take record of it and ask the question during the session on your behalf. Now, with all that preamble completed, I now bring you Helen Pluckrose and Gus Lyn-Piluso. Helen and Gus, welcome to the talk.
Thank you, Rohit. Wow, Helen, I'm really excited to be talking to you after having read your work for such a long time. And just in the interest of transparency, I want everyone to know, and I want you to know too, that your work has been extremely important to me. It's really helped me claw myself out of the postmodern quagmire that much of my own early education left me in. So I want to thank you for that, and I want everyone to know that, that this is the position I'm coming from.
Yeah, thank you.
All
it's
right.
good to talk to you.
It's really great. Having said that, I also want to make it clear that I'm also very interested in social justice. I've always thought that the ethical thing to do is to try to leave the world a little better than you found it. And that we should really devote ourselves to what has in the past been called social justice. Now it's very confusing as to what we mean by that term now. That's one of the things I want to explore with you. Mm. Also, in the interest of transparency, when we announced that we would be having this event with you, we got a fair number of complaints. We got complaints from people who thought we shouldn't be platforming you because of your position on social justice, and those that felt that CFIC shouldn't be dealing with social justice issues, period. Right. We should just stick to science and reason, and somehow that two don't come together. Mm. So this is where we're coming from. right now. Now, controversy seems to follow you. You can't write one tweet without having a lot of controversy following you. I have no idea how you do that. I've seen you being called an anti-feminist, a misogynist, an alt-right person, a men's rights activist. I've even seen you being called a racist and a rape apologist.
Right, yes.
What is it about you that's so controversial?
I think because I am critical of certain approaches to social justice issues, there's a certain kind of thinking in which people who are very sort of ideologically rigid, in which they believe that anybody who doesn't agree with their methods for addressing a social problem doesn't think that the social problem exists, or they don't think the problem's a problem. And this is something I come up against time and time again. Yes, very often recently, because I've been addressing social justice methodologies like intersectionality and queer theory, I am being accused of being a secret right-winger who hates minorities and women and everybody else. But before that, because we, all three of us, were quite critical of religion, and because of where we are geographically, Christianity was our main target, we were generally then accused of being far left, sort of Marxists who just wanted to make the world an atheist or whatever. And even now, today I have been getting a lot of abuse from Trumpists, because I said if I were American, I would support Biden in the upcoming election. And that has caused a lot of people to spend a lot of time telling me I believe things I don't believe for motivations I don't have. And I spend far too much time trying to dig myself out of all of that. I think it's a sort of natural result of being a liberal humanist. Everybody to the far right or far left of you sees you as belonging to the other camp.
So it's just part of the territory then?
I think so.
All right, well, further to this, a few weeks ago, I asked you to fill out a very simple political spectrum questionnaire, a Canadian political spectrum questionnaire, just to see where you stood in terms of Canadian politics. And it turns out you supported the Greens Party, 88% of the Green Party's position, and 87% of the Liberal Party's position, and 84% of the New Democratic Party's position. Now, the New Democratic Party, I would say, is like the left wing of your Labour Party. No. This doesn't sound like the profile of a right-winger to me.
No, I call myself a liberal lefty, because by that I mean that I am liberal in the sense that I center the individual and the human. So for me, what is important is each person being able to access everything that society has to offer, and a recognition of our shared humanity. I'm staunchly in favour of freedom of belief and freedom of speech. This sometimes gets confused with supporting all of the horrible speech that can be spoken. And I call myself a lefty because my economic policies are left-wing. I support progressive taxes and national health care and a strong welfare state. I'm more concerned with class issues, which I think underlie most of the social inequalities. However, I'm not convinced, and this is why I get called an anti-feminist. I am not convinced that sexism against women is a systematic problem. I am well aware that individual sexists still exist. I have encountered quite a lot of them, but I don't think society as a whole generally has a norm of undervaluing women. I do think we still have a significant problem with racism, with homophobia, and with genuine transphobia. Of course, I think people who have different ideas about what gender is, particularly gender critical feminists, can be accused of transphobia, which is a different issue to problems social conservatives have with trans issues, but I think those are social justice issues which are still much more relevant than feminist causes, although of course there are issues which are purely women's. So we've only just got access to abortion for women in Ireland, for example. So that's something which really is a women's issue, which I support.
So you're really talking about classical liberalism?
I don't think so, because normally when people say classical liberalism, it turns out that they mean something like libertarian economics. And my economics are intuitively socialist, but I don't think socialism actually works. So I just want to tax rich people a lot to sort of make sure the sort of public services are funded. I would be happier with traditional liberalism, because I'm certainly from the tradition of Wollstonecraft of Mill. And that kind of freedom and equality approach.
So staying with liberalism for a bit, you said that liberal project's marketplace of ideas is the best way for us to hammer out what is true. Might we not say that that's what's going on now? That isn't the tension between theorists like you and the social justice activists simply the invisible hand of the marketplace doing its work?
I don't think so. I'd like it if it would be like that, because the difference, sort of both liberals and social justice activists who are very critical of liberalism, believe that language is extremely important. Liberals tend to believe that it's important because it enables us to make arguments, to evaluate other people's arguments, and to sift ideas, whereas the critical social justice people tend to believe that we have dominant discourses that have been legitimized because they have been given power. They consider science primary among these, and this is a Western way of knowing. We believe things are true because of the value we give certain kinds of discourses in society. So for them, the marketplace of ideas cannot work because there isn't a level playing field from which people can argue. Now, this doesn't mean that I cannot have productive conversations with people who hold these kinds of beliefs. I'm hoping soon to discuss the role of women's agency with a social justice feminist and a conservative woman, and that is likely to be very productive. But unfortunately, because of the belief that language can be dangerous, that it can reinforce oppressive systems, what we often find is more of an attempt to shut down the speech that is seen as dangerous, and then that within a lot of the theory as well, so particularly in someone like Robin DiAngelo, worked into the theory is that there is no legitimate way to criticize the ideas. If you everything to DiAngelo, so arguing, staying quiet or going away is all a sign of fragility. There isn't a possibility there for legitimate disagreement. So the marketplace of ideas, that the type of theorists we criticize don't submit their ideas to the marketplace. They won't allow them to be evaluated.
So in terms of DiAngelo, what you're referring to here is the Kafka Trap.
Yes, very much so. You can't really argue with that. That was it. And I got that from Trumpists earlier today as well. If I think that Trump isn't the most wonderful president ever, it's because I've been deceived by by mainstream media into believing false discourses. It really is indistinguishable.
So there's a connection there between the right and the left.
I think there's a sort of psychological trait of ideologues who really think that they have the truth, and then they cannot accept a legitimate disagreement. You must be deceived in some way to be charitable, or ill-motivated.
And is this the same connection you're making between ideology and religion? I know that McWhorter has made that same connection.
Yeah. It seems to work very much in the same way. So, for example, when I was mostly arguing with religious believers, they would tell me to read the Bible, and I would say that I had read the Bible 4 times and I'd done my undergraduate and postgraduate studies in theology, and they would tell me then that I clearly hadn't understood it and I was to keep reading it until I understood it. Now, I get that a lot from social justice activists as well. This was one of the reasons we did the project, which has caused us so much controversy, in which we submitted papers that used some of the worst theories and made some horrible arguments, because people kept saying to me that I just didn't understand the theory. It didn't matter how much I explained it to them, how much I'd shown them, I'd written about it. They insisted that unless I agreed with it, I didn't understand it. And that you can't argue with that. There's no discussion of this in the marketplace of ideas.
I'm going to ask you a little bit later about the grievance studies, but for now, just a couple of more questions about liberalism. So one of the great things about liberalism is that it has tolerance for intolerance. But just how tolerant should we be?
I think, yeah, this one of the weaknesses of liberalism, and you know, this is something that conservatives tend to point out, is that it does allow for the expression of intolerant ideas, which can allow them to grow. So I've been having an argument today in which people said liberalism cannot be the solution to the social justice problem, because that arose because it wasn't squashed. Now, I still think it is much better to have those ideas out there. I don't think they should have been squashed. I think they should be protected under freedom of belief, but we have to apply the principles of liberalism and the principles of secularism to them, in which we say you have every right to hold these beliefs, express these beliefs, and apply them to your life. You cannot insist that anybody else affirms them. So yes, liberalism doesn't have the same kind of ironclad barriers against potentially problematic thinking that a totalitarian system would have. It allows for blasphemy, heresy, and sort of explorations of all kinds. But I think that is a strength rather than a weakness. I think the very best book ever written about this was Jonathan Rauch's Kindly Inquisitors, in which he looks at how anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and how homophobia were best challenged by allowing people to make the arguments which are really offensive to the dignity of gay people and to Jews, and to have them roundly defeated. That, he argued, defeated them much better than banning or criminalizing the expression of them. And I agree with that.
So I do too, I think. But how much bandwidth should we allow people? I mean, in other words, how much energy should we put into allowing to hearing people's ideas that are so objectionable?
So that is a completely different question, you see, because if we're defending the right of people to have ideas and express them, this is very different to committing to hear all of them. So I will sometimes decline to have conversations about things that I am either not knowledgeable enough about or not interested enough to have. There are some questions now that I just don't want to argue about anymore. Because I used to argue about religion so much, I quite often get Christians saying to me, trying to get me into a conversation because I've said something which makes it clear that I don't think God exists. They will then say, because I've made this statement, I am duty bound to defend it and listen to their argument. And no, I'm not. Part of freedom of speech is the freedom not to listen, just as part of freedom of belief is the freedom not to believe.
All right, let's move on to postmodernism and critical race theory. Now, your book was due out here in Canada on the 25th, but it's a little delayed. It'll be out on September 10th, and it's called Cynical Theories. And much of your book has to do with really helping us understand postmodernism and critical race theory. So help us understand how the social justice movement of today is rooted in postmodernism of the 80s, and how it became first applied and now reified.
Right. So our book goes through those three stages. It's best to understand us as working backwards from what we see now and tracing those ideas back. So some people have complained that when we discuss postmodernism, we only look at a few of the ideas of it. And that's true, but that's because those are the ideas which have gone on. So in the mid-60s to the late 60s, there was a sudden proliferation of writing from people like Lyotard, Baudrillard, Foucault, Derrida, and they were radically skeptical of what Lyotard referred to as meta-narratives, those big overarching explanations for things like Christianity, like Marxism, but also according to the postmodernist science. They saw science as an uncritically accepted meta-narrative as well. So they were skeptical of that. They argued that these narratives were actually the product of powerful forces, that certain powerful groups in society had the power to decide what was true. They'd legitimated those discourses being ways of talking about things. And these were then internalized by everybody and just spread around so that it seemed like common sense. So the purpose of undoing all this, archaeology as Foucault called it, was to dig into what these power dynamics were and to deconstruct it so you could see how they worked. Now, that first lot of postmodernists were fairly aimless. They were decidedly leftist in their challenge to power, but they weren't really politically actionable in any way. So they kind of deconstructed themselves by the middle of the 80s. Then we saw the rise of the next lot of theorists, and something happened in 1989, and then there was a sudden rush of new writing from people like Kimberly Crenshaw, Judith Butler, Mary Poovey, people coming from all over the place saying, these postmodern ideas are good, but we can't do anything with them if nothing is really real. We have to accept that something is real. For us to address oppression, we need to accept that a certain group of people have consistent experiences. So they wanted to make these systems of power and privilege objectively real. And then postmodernism, these postmodern ideas of power, knowledge, and discourse became quite simplified and put into political action for dismantling these systems. So we had at this point post-colonial theory, which had been developing a bit longer, but then queer theory really emerged around 1990, intersectionality in 1989. We had critical race theory was developing from various streams all at the same time, but it took on quite a lot of this postmodern theory via Black feminism to quite an extent. And these new kind of theories took off, and they were much more user-friendly. So over the last 30 years since then, there has been work done on developing these theories. They have become clearer and more sure of themselves, whereas the first postmodernists were really very difficult to read, and they were ambiguous and uncertain on principle. What we've seen coming out in the last 5 years is really very certain of itself. We get words of absolutism. Again, I'm going back to Robin DiAngelo because she's the pure example of what we call now reified postmodernism, because it's become so solid and concretized. It's been made into a real thing. It's most commonly known as wokeism. And we get from her this, it is impossible to avoid being socialized into racism. There is absolutely no way. This is just the truth. So now we've got this strange situation where these core ideas, which originally arose in order to be skeptical of meta-narratives, is now itself gone to form a very rigid meta-narrative that you will find and you will hear in mantras which you must not contravene, such as trans women are women, and white privilege, white supremacy, patriarchy, all of these claims of really solid power structures that denial of any of them is proof of bigotry and an attempt to preserve your own privilege. So that was a long explanation, but that was essentially the whole book.
Okay, so help me understand something. How do these ideas move from basically the ivory tower to protests? Is it a mimemic process? Is sort of like a mind virus that spilled out of the universities and into activism?
I think it's come out in several ways, because it's had 50 years now. Often social justice tries to present itself as a new edgy thing, but it really is, most of the original progenitors of its core ideas have now died. So it's not new. But yeah, we've had universities that have been turning out heads of various industries with various stages of this postmodern thought. It's gone off in different directions. Philosophy is still very much with the first postmodernists generally, but within the kind of studies that have grown up, women's studies, gender studies, sexuality studies, gay and lesbian studies, race studies, ethnic studies, these kind of fields have had a lot of prestige, and they have become authoritative on certain issues of culture and identity. In addition to people leaving the university with these the skills and the knowledge of these kind of theories, we also have the activism. At the end of the 80s, when this next wave came up, the civil rights movements were seeing diminishing returns. Throughout the 60s and 70s, there was a great wave of legal reforms benefiting women, racial minorities, sexual minorities. Once those were essentially done, racism, sexism, homophobia didn't just go away. So there was an urge then on the part of activists to address what was left, the remaining prejudices and assumptions. So liberal feminists and activists have done a lot of this in quite a sort of measured way. I considered myself, when I came into feminism in 1990, to be that kind of feminist, a liberal feminist. I was challenging any assumptions that I came up against, that I would behave in any way because I was a woman. And so there was that kind of thing going on. But of course, one branch of feminism found the postmodern idea of discourses particularly useful because it can read into these discourses, it can analyze them, interpret them. It's looking for bias, attitudes, and what has come to be developed into things like microaggressions and what they call dog whistles, because there's this framework that is conceived of in which there are a lot of ideas, and a discourse, it pops up in lots of different ways. So if you use one word, people who have been tuned into these discourses will suddenly assume a lot of other beliefs that are connected to that. They may call it a dog whistle or something like that, and they will read you into this whole discursive system. Now, this can be done on all kinds of levels. When people say, how have these obscure academic ideas found their way into the general public, including people who haven't been to university, we need to look at how these kind of ideologies work generally. If we look at a country in which, say, something like Islam is a strong belief system, then we have a few people who are the sophisticated theologians who dedicate their lives to this. Then we have the imams and the religious leaders who make it their job. And then you have the general public who have taken on a certain amount of this with certain degrees of knowledge. And it kind of works on all levels, almost as Foucault said, discourses do work.
So the power is in the words, sounds like you're saying.
Yeah.
But isn't there some truth to that? So isn't history written by the victors?
Yes.
Doesn't it take someone with privilege to have the time and the energy to write a book? Isn't there something to that?
There is. There absolutely is. And this is why we didn't necessarily need the postmodernists to start addressing this, because they started getting influence in activism in the 80s. But in fact, people had been challenging these discourses, liberals had been, for decades, if not centuries before this. We know, for example, in the UK, that the first atheists were challenging religion in the late 16th century. We don't know this because they wrote anything, because they couldn't, but we know this because a lot of rebuttals to atheist claims suddenly emerged. So postmodernists didn't invent the idea that language has power, that culture influences how we think. You know, nobody really assumes that language doesn't have power, and it's a complete coincidence that religions and ideological beliefs sort of occur in clusters across the world. But the liberals have more confidence in humans. With this, they believe that we have the ability to evaluate these different ideas, whereas the postmodernists, and particularly Foucault, tend to see us as uncritically sort of sucked into these discourses that work through us almost as though we have no agency or ability to control it, unless we are properly trained by theorists in this particular field.
Okay, but to be fair, postmodernism was in part a critique of of things like the First and Second World War, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Isn't that, didn't modernism warrant a serious critique?
Yes. And as I say, they are not the only people who are criticizing it. The problem with postmodernism is not that it criticized uncritically held narratives, but that it did it badly. People have always criticized these kind of narratives. Certain skeptical methodologies have grown up to check how we know that things we assume are true are actually true. So science is key among this, and it's probably why postmodernism is particularly critical of science, because that is a very influential skeptical method, whereas sometimes current social justice activists and scholars like to pretend science is a big body of facts that people just assume are true. That isn't what science is. It's a skeptical methodology which doesn't accept that anything is true absolutely. It keeps testing it. So this is a skepticism that predates postmodern skepticism, and it's why we called our book Cynical Theories, because we argued that skepticism against meta-narratives is a very, very good thing. It's something that's been happening throughout the modern period. It's worked extremely well to overcome theocracy, patriarchy, colonialism, slavery. And postmodernism isn't, as it likes to present itself, a more in-depth continuation of that, but a cynical, radically skeptical approach. There isn't much benefit to skepticism unless you accept that a truth can be obtained, even if you're never completely sure you've obtained it. Having that as an aim, I think Alan Sokal and Jean Bricmont said it best when they said specific scientific skepticism asks, how do we know this idea is true? How could we prove it wasn't? And then it's looking for a specific answer, so that's interesting and important. But radical skepticism says we can never really know anything's true. And so it's both aimless and not particularly interesting or helpful.
Okay, so let's take something like standpoint theory, which really comes out of this postmodernism. So I'm a man, and I can never experience I've never experienced life other than being a man. If and when I were engaging in some sort of theorizing or research, how can I be sure that I'm not seeing things from my particular male perspective? How can I adjust for that? And doesn't standpoint theory help us to do that?
No, science would help you do that. If you feared that your masculinity was affecting your results, then the scientific approach would say, have a woman do the same thing, see if it makes any difference. But I think a lot of what I think, the kernel of value in what you're saying there, I think, is that sometimes we need to know what somebody's experience of something is, and sometimes we need to know what the facts of something are. So there's this wonderful account in Barbara Applebaum's otherwise terrible book, Being White, Being Good. And she speaks of an account of a survivor of Auschwitz who remembered the fires at Auschwitz, and in her memory, all 4 of the chimneys burned down. Now, when people went to examine the site, only 1 of them had burnt down. So her experience was different to the facts of the matter. But the facts of the matter were less important, perhaps we would say, than this individual's experience. As humans, we are more interested in how she experienced that, how she can overcome that, how she can be helped to overcome that, how we can make sure that doesn't happen again. So as humans, experiences and perceptions are very important to us, and they vary according to who people are and what position they are. This is not a mystery. This is not unknown. This is not denied by people who criticize postmodernism. We just don't think that they should be conflated. So, for example, I will know how it feels to have a baby. You will not. But if the knowledge that was necessary at this moment was how gestation worked, we'd need an obstetrician. If you were an obstetrician and I was not, your knowledge of this would be more important than mine. So keeping perception experience separate from factual empirical evidence is important when it needs to be done. It doesn't always need to be done.
This is really interesting to me because I see myself as a Deweyan educator. So when I'm in classes, I always like to start with the experiences of the students. I ask them how they've experienced a certain issue. For example, if I'm teaching sociology, how have they experienced whatever the topic we're talking about? Dewey talked about how it's good to start with the experience of the person and then help them build their knowledge from there. People like Bell Hooks and others have focused on the notion of lived experience, and I think this is what you're critiquing here. Isn't there something valuable in starting with people's lived experiences? And my question is the issue just that the postmodernists, if you like, or the reified critical race theorists are getting stuck at the lived experience point?
Yeah, I think there's a need to, you really can see the significance of somebody's lived experience and perception when you compare it to the reality. So, for example, if we have a perception, so one in my, because I too, I'm most interested as a social historian in people's experiences. So there was a perception in the late 14th century that men were particularly vulnerable to the Black Death. This was recorded all over the place. This scientists recently have said this is quite possibly because men's immune systems are weaker. Then grave sites were examined, and it was found that there wasn't any difference at all, that as many men and women died. So the interesting thing then becomes, why did people perceive a greater death of men? And this is almost certainly because men were more in the public sphere. Similarly here, Brits were asked what percentage of the population is Muslim. The answer was 21%. The real answer is 5%. Now, we can't go with Brits' lived experience and say, well, this is their truth. And then if the power balances were different, we might perhaps ask Muslims to take up less space and be less evident because of this experience. Instead, what we would want to know is, what is under this? Why is there such a huge overestimation? And then that is where the interesting sociological sort of investigations come in. It isn't enough to say, nope, you're wrong, here are the facts. You'd want to know why. And then you get the interesting information about people being afraid of Islam and whether they are afraid with good reason, mostly not. And this can be discussed.
Okay. Thanks. You've hinted around the issue of class earlier, and I just want to get back to it. Adolph Reed, who is a political scientist, he says that the problem with the social justice movement today is that it focuses too much on race and not on class. And we had a presentation here by Jamu Nagwaya, who is a professor in the University of West Indies, and he said pretty much the same thing, that we're neglecting class. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that fits into your understanding of the issue we're going through right now?
Yeah, I'm not I'm not a Marxist, but I am sympathetic to the Marxist and materialist critiques of social justice on these grounds. So there was, particularly, there's a lot of citations of Black Panthers who argued that we needed to unite the working class, that there shouldn't be division between race. And this is a lot of what the Marxists and socialists will often argue, and they will point out that a lot of the issues that are taking place, the things that are under discussion, are to do with wealthy Black and white people, for example, and disparities seen between them, and perhaps a very wealthy, a very successful actress got paid a couple of million less than a very successful actor. And so this, they feel, is neglecting the issue of class. Now, I think the Marxists, when they focus solely on class, can miss quite a lot, because there are identity issues as well. There is racism, there is discrimination on the grounds of identity. And I think quite a lot of them do accept this, and they will say class first, not only. So that, I think, is a better analysis. I've just finished Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, The Lies That Divide Us, and I expected to hate that book, but actually I didn't. And she's given me a lot to think about. I do disagree with quite a lot of it, but I haven't actually solidified my thoughts on this yet, because she suggests to us another option where we don't have to say the problem is race or the problem is class. If we're looking at, for example, why African Americans have worse economic outcomes so consistently, we can look at things in the nature of caste, which kind of plays into both of them, but works psychologically quite differently with in-groups and out-groups. So I need to give that a bit more thought, but I think that's quite possibly a way to reconcile those ideas. But yes, certainly the social justice scholars do tend to neglect class, which doesn't really go with their aims to have an intersectional analysis which takes in all these different features.
Okay, let's move on to some general questions now. Your grievance study project.
Yes.
Some of your critics have suggested it was academic fraud. How do you respond to that?
Well, we wanted to see what would happen if we sent in certain ideas, and we couldn't see that without doing it. So yeah, we've been accused we fabricated data, and that is undeniably true. But if anyone can suggest a better way to see what happens in the system of peer review if you send some data that is impossible or at least implausible, and then you draw conclusions from it that aren't remotely warranted, we wanted to see how that process would work. We don't think that academic fraud applies because we revealed the project ourselves. We always intended to. It didn't go into the academic record. And in fact, the investigation into Peter, who was the one of us who had an academic appointment, into whether he had committed academic fraud, decided he didn't, and that it was allowable under, I think they call it a hoax of exposure. That was something that we looked into, because we didn't damage the academic record for our own benefit.
Now, also, some of your critics have a problem with some of the company you keep.
Probably.
So sovereign nations, what is your relationship with them? And aren't they a right-wing group, Christian group?
They are quite crazy Christians, yes. Yes, they put on an event for us, and they do all kinds of talks. So they showed us, because we were a little bit wary of them, obviously, as atheists. And they showed us that they'd put on talks between Muslims and Christians, between socialists and various people. We met with them, and I believe that they want to. They want to keep the marketplace of ideas open. They believe that if they do so, Christianity will win out. I have told them I don't think it will. Told them I'm not, I don't intend. I see Christianity, particularly sort of illiberal conservative kinds, as at least as much of a problem as illiberal leftism. But I can talk to them. They're I don't know. We are crazy Christians. I feel a bit mean because Michael is quite sweet in many ways, but I can't find a lot in common with him.
Okay. So recently we've seen, and I know in the UK as well, some tearing down of statues.
Yeah.
So doesn't social action like this actually help raise consciousness about the real racism?
Yep.
And isn't it a good thing? So I'm thinking specifically in things of Indian independence. Would it have come about without the Salt March, or gay liberation without the Stonewall uprising?
I'm really not too bothered if a statue of a slave trader gets thrown into a river. Nobody is being hurt by that. Nobody's business is being destroyed, leading them to have financial problems or go bankrupt. And this is also history. the destruction of a statue, if it stays there at the bottom of the sea, then that will be a historical thing, how the statue came to be in the bottom of the sea. While I understand and I respect arguments that really we should go through democratic processes if we want to remove some of these, and they should go to a museum, and destruction of property is a crime and everything, it's really not a priority as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to make a fuss about that.
You don't have a problem with activism today that takes that sort of direct action?
It's not a priority. I think if I were to be asked, is it wrong to destroy things like that rather than go through a democratic process, I would say yes. If I were asked, is it in the public interest to prosecute this, I would say no. I'm afraid I have a rather ambiguous and unsatisfying answer to that one.
Okay, can you help us understand your notion of the ideological theory of mind?
Oh, yes. This is where I think we have problems where people are not trying to understand where other people are coming from. So that sounds quite simple, but I think there's a deeper let me start again. So with theory of mind, this is what we mean when we can guess how somebody else is feeling quite accurately, even if we're not feeling that way ourselves. Doing this when it comes to an ideology would mean putting yourself in the other person's shoes, imagining that what they believe is actually true. And if you take the premises of what they believe and you work from them, it will give you an almost entirely different understanding of what their motivations are, and you can respond to them much better. So, for example, if a Christian is trying to convert me, who's trying to get me to become a Christian, I could think, well, you're being pushy, you think you're right, you don't respect my beliefs. But if I recognize that they believe that if I don't accept their belief, I won't go to heaven, and they care about me, then it comes into a different light. I still don't have to accept it, but this looks less like hateful intolerance and more like friendly concern. So you can then engage with it in a different way. And an example I often give of where we have a real failure of ideological theory of mind, it's when we've got the gender critical feminists who don't believe that gender is real, so they don't accept that trans identity is real. They believe that trans women are men who are trying to invade their space, and that this is a danger to women. And then we have trans activists who believe gender is entirely a self-identity, and they see gender critical feminists as opposing trans people who are among the most persecuted of all people. And so they will just go at each other. Well, you're a misogynist who doesn't care about women. You're a transphobe who doesn't care about trans people. When what we really need both of them to be doing is understanding each other's concerns and coming together for a reasonable discussion, which could result in some kind of negotiation where trans people have rights, dignity, and respect, and women don't lose spaces or ability to compete in sport. Do you see what I mean?
So one final question, because I think we have 4 minutes left.
Oh gosh, that went fast.
And I think it picks up on what you just said. A colleague of mine says that when it comes to the social justice movement of today, that it's no longer a conversation, but it's a war. And he thinks we should understand this and respond accordingly. Nick Buckley, who is a homeless activist in the UK, he suggested a couple of weeks ago that the best way to confront them is through love. Where do you stand on this?
I think we need two approaches. I understand the people who say we can't just keep discussing things forever. We have to take a stand against this. And I think that we do. And I think that that stand needs to be a recognition of the social justice worldview in the same category as other belief systems like religious ones, so that the rules of secularism can be applied to it. So you can believe that, but you cannot impose it on me. If we're at work together, you cannot come up and demand that I believe in invisible systems of whiteness and can confess my own racism or whatever, any more than you can come up and insist that I confess Christ. So that, I think, is something that needs to be done quite quickly. It doesn't impinge on the rights of any believers of social justice. But in the long term, in order to address these ideas, I think, and I'm always speaking from a liberal perspective, we do need ongoing conversations. Those of us who consider ourselves liberal would do well to admit that sometimes the liberal humanist focus on the smallest unit of society, the individual, and the largest, the human race, can neglect both class issues and identity issues. So in my mind, the best framework overall would be a liberal one, which also took input from socialists, class analysis, and from social justice activists focusing on race, gender identity, and that kind of thing. And that needs to have an ongoing conversation. And I think ultimately some of the ideas of social justice need to die. We need to have a dominant sort of consensus that evidence and reason and consistently applied principles are important, but that doesn't mean we have to lose everything or stop focusing on any of the useful bits that can come from these kind of identity-based theories.
Wow. Well, thanks so much, Helen. It's an absolute pleasure having this opportunity to ask you some questions. And now I really want to encourage the audience to ask whatever they feel. Particularly, I'd like to, I mean, anyone could ask questions, but particularly if anyone here considers himself an activist, please, particularly the kind that Helen might be critiquing, this is your chance. Ask her now. I look forward to.
Yeah, please prioritize those people. They're always best.
So thank you, Helen. I'm going to mute now and give it over to Shauna.
Oh, thanks, Gus.
So we've received a few questions. We're going to ask people to put their questions on the chat. So if you do submit a question, please let me know if you're okay with having your name used when I pose your question. And so I'm going to ask the first question, which is from Francis Widdowson, who's a professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University. And the question is, do you think that economic interests are at the root of wokeism, rent-seeking through the use of identity to access jobs, promotions, grants, etc.? Is this about putting barriers up to entry and tying with respect to demanding socially produced resources?
Okay, I think that the most honest answer to that would be that I cannot really know without mind reading how much opportunism there is going on within this movement. I tend to believe that the majority of people who are involved in the social justice movement are true believers that this is how society works, these systems of power and these discourses. But I'm sure there will be people who take advantage of a system, because there always are. I don't think that cynical, opportunistic motives are at the root of these things, but that doesn't mean they can't be used for those purposes. And I can think of a couple of situations in which I think it has been.
Thank you. Another question, you talked a little bit about systemic racism. So the question is, do you think systemic racism is a problem?
Okay, so there's a couple of definitions of systemic. If we're talking about institutional racism, are institutions of society set up in ways that disadvantage some races over another? This is an empirical question. There is some reason to think that they are. So there's some good empirical studies into incarceration rates and arrest rates in the US suggest that Black Americans are more likely to be prosecuted for crimes, I think, than white Americans. I don't have this data, but this is something that would then be systemic. There have also been studies that show that people with African American names are less likely to get called back than people with Anglo names or people with African names. So these kind of empirical studies are very strong. I don't know how much they exist and where, but they need to be studied by rigorous scholars. The understanding of systemic racism that comes out of the work of critical race theorists like D'Angelo and Layla Saad and these kind of theorists speaks of a system of discourses. Essentially, they see society as a system in which white people are socialized to believe that they are superior, black people and brown people are socialized to believe that they are second-class citizens, and that this system works through all of us. I don't think that that's entirely false. I'm sure that there are racist assumptions that people have, but I don't believe in people's minds working as systems, as socialization, working as this one united system. I think humans can see the systems around them. They can see racist assumptions. They can choose to accept them, reject them, or oppose them.
Thank you. Okay, this question is from Rick Rapetti. If persons of color are convinced of Robin DiAngelo's theory of universally necessary white fragility / supremacy, won't they be highly likely to bring that lens to all their lived experience, seemingly conforming the theory? But if this is so, isn't this a blend of projection and confirmation bias?
Yeah. I think this is very much the problem with the kind of theory epitomized by somebody like Robin DiAngelo. And it's also the subject of The Coddling of the American Mind by Lukianoff and Haidt, in which they argue that if people are taught to see systems like this, to read interactions through these kind of systems, then they are going to see things which support these systems, that it's going to affect mostly the people who are understood to be disadvantaged. This worries me considerably, and in the context of feminism and having a teenage daughter myself, I have been quite concerned about some feminist narratives which have really made the world out to be entirely hostile to women, and telling them that they simply won't be taken seriously or as professional. And I think that would be a terrible assumption for a young woman to go into the public sphere, into her working life with. I don't think that this can possibly help racial minorities either, if they are told that society is ranged against them. And I think, yes, you can read things like this if you are told to. An example that I often give, because so we've got Robin DiAngelo and a set of other scholars, and they gave us some tenets of critical race theory. And one of them was, the question is not did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in this situation? So you have the situation and you have to detect racism in it because it is bound to be there. So if a white retail assistant if a black person and a white person entered a shop and a white retail assistant assisted the white person first, this could be read as racist because the white person was seen as having priority. If they assisted the black person first, the racism would be in this demonstrating that they were afraid of them walking around the shop unsupervised. So you can always read racism into a situation. It isn't a rigorous epistemology. It isn't it is a problem of confirmation bias, and it's very likely to undermine the confidence of the people it's supposed to help.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Social justice warriors have goals such as ending the disproportionate level of imprisonment of young men of color in the US. Conversations have not addressed this situation. How long do people of color in the US have to wait while polite conversations take place? If my son were in jail, I would be largely impatient. What are the alternatives beside protesting?
I think this is where we particularly need empirical scholarship and liberal activism. I think a lot of the problem with social justice approaches which are so theoretical is that they firstly don't include convincing evidence of imbalances, and they secondly alienate people by making everything so sort of tribal, whereas if you can have empirical scholarship, and I think Michelle Alexander is somebody who's done a lot of this, looking at the different rates of people being pulled over and searched, the different outcomes for committing of crime, and appealing to people on a liberal basis. You know, why is this one set of humans being disproportionately targeted by this system? This is where I think we have the strength of liberal activism to actually convince people.
Thank you. Can we hope to arrive at rigorously scientific definitions of gender, race, and sexual identity, etc.?
I think that there have been some, and Dr. Deborah So, I just read her book, The End of Gender, which clarified these terms. Of course, the complication here isn't so much that biologists are using the terms ambiguously as that theorists are. So if you have a radical feminist, for example, who believes that gender is entirely a social construct and that psychological differences between men and women don't exist, which a lot of them, but not all of them do, then this obviously just relegates gender to an oppressive social construct. If you have a trans activist theoretical understanding of gender as something an individual, it's sort of socially productive, but it's something that an individual knows and is to be respected as their identity, we still have it as some kind of nebulous concept. So I think we're not going to come to a scientific consensus on what gender is that is accepted by people with ideological commitments to various kinds of feminism. But as far as the scientific community seems to go, there seems to be fairly solid ones.
Thank you. You said that institutional racism is a problem that needs to be studied, if I recall correctly. And so the question is, isn't that what critical race theory does?
No, it isn't. Within critical race theory, there are two main branches. So there are materialists, who are epitomized by people like Derek Bell, and then there are those who come from the postmodern branch. So the materialists tend to be quite empirical in that they use data and examples, but there is an awful lot of cherry picking going on here. So we have things like Derek Bell taking a document which argues that the civil rights movement was only enabled because it was in white people's interests to allow black people to have rights because of so I can't remember exactly what it was he argued, but his interest conversion theory at that time argued that that white people only allow black people rights when it suits them. And so there was a very kind of cynical reading of documents. And then we have the postmodern approach, which looks very much at attitudes and biases and isn't terribly empirical. Where they have tried to be empirical, it has been mostly with use of the implicit association test, which is did not replicate on its second round of studies and has now been much criticized. So critical race theory, and really any kind of theory that begins with critical, is not generally an empirical approach to studying racism.
Thank you. We have a question about intersectionality. The question is, as intersectionality focuses more on hierarchy within the intersectional realm, will it eventually burn itself out and be replaced by another paradigm? And if so, what do you think will replace it?
I think for a long time it seemed as though there were going to be all these different identities in tension, but what we've seen happen over the last couple of years is certain oppressed identities be dropped and others take prominence. So gay men, for example, are no longer generally a priority for intersectional activists because they have not consistently been intersectional in their approach. Women, since the election of Donald Trump particularly, there have been, we've seen the rise of the white women's tears and the Karen trope, which shows that it's quite difficult now to argue that just being a woman is an oppressed identity. We've seen Jews and Asians be accused of being white adjacent. So really at the moment, the two major identity groups which are seen as important are race and trans identity. So these are operating separately from each other at the moment, with some overlap from intersectional activists, but they don't tend to work that well together. So I foresee some kind of a battle happening between the two of them in the next sort of few months, and I predict that the race identity will take top place.
Thank you. We have a question about some of your comments on woke culture. So the comment says that your description of it, particularly how it's completely closed to any external criticism, looks a bit like a straw man argument. The question is, does wokeism really dismiss all critiques as reinforcing racism and sexism? And if so, then how did it gain so much currency in today's discourse?
Right. Well, I would say there are people who have strong social justice beliefs who also allow criticism. So they will sometimes get into discussion with, say, materialist feminists or with liberals or with others. But the type of scholarship and activism that we are particularly focused on is the kind that doesn't. So in the book that I've just written, Cynical Theories, we look at 3 examples of this in Barbara Applebaum, when she speaks about having to accept the central tenets of social justice education before you can discuss it. So she doesn't accept disagreement from her students that those systems of power and privilege actually exist. For Alison Bailey, this is described as privilege preserving epistemic pushback, and she then argues that people who disagree with the structure of it are really trying to preserve their own epistemology as a dominant group. Robin DiAngelo, particularly, as we've said, everything apart from staying put and agreeing with her is seen as a sign of white fragility. So this isn't to say that everybody who believes these kind of things is closed to discussion, but the people who are open to it don't tend to be the ones that I'm criticizing.
Okay, thank you. Somebody asks, Andre Brown asks, do you have top 3 reading recommendations for someone trying to get a good overview of the current philosophical milieu, specifically its origins and how we got here?
Yeah, I think a particularly good book. It's in the UK, it is called the Fontana Postmodernism Reader. And the reason I like this one so much is because it's written in 1994, when right on the cusp of when the core postmodern ideas that were going into the next wave of theories were really being solidified and simplified. So I think anybody who reads all of that will get a really good grounding in it. There's the Encyclopedia of Social Justice Education, I think it's called, and that is also extremely useful for giving you a look at everything. And there's the New Discourses site, and it's got its translations from the Wokish. So you will understand from that it is a critical look at the different aspects of this kind of scholarship, but it does begin by citing it as the theorists actually do, and then discussing the potential problems with it. So I think if you were to go with all 3 of those, you'd have a good basis from the people who agree with it, and then a critical approach. You seem to be muted.
Sorry. Thank you. We still have time for some more questions, so feel free to post. I have one question that says, is there no place for early lived experience being repeated throughout life? We as Black people are not taught about racial paradigms. We experience it throughout life and connect with others with similar experiences wherever they are from in the diaspora. Is that confirmation bias or lived experience?
I think there certainly always is place for experience, and this is what I was discussing with Gus earlier. The idea that we need to not conflate different perspectives on things in the terms of standpoint epistemology with the facts of things when there is an objective reality doesn't mean that we don't care about the experiences of people who have suffered any kind of oppression or prejudice. So I think the idea that we can either have one or the other, lived experiences or or factual information, is a false dilemma. And what we have to remember, though, when we're talking about different experiences and knowledge connected to identity, is that people are individuals. So the worrying thing with a lot of the intersectional activism is that they tend to take the experiences and the arguments of people who are also intersectional and then declare these to be authoritative for a certain identity group, and then react really quite hostilely to anybody from that identity group who has a different approach to anything. So we will see, for example, ex-Muslims be called things like house informants, native informants and house Muslims, and we hear worse racial slurs for Black people who are liberal or even conservative. So I think, you know, we can be too blanket and say, well, we can only have this and we don't trust that. But as humans, I think there's a sort of a degree of complexity there where we can address a whole load of different issues and care about a whole load of different issues in different ways.
Thank you. We have a question from a teacher who is studying measurement and evaluation in education. The question is, to what extent can teachers raise awareness about racism in schools? How can school education promote critical thinking, social justice, and activism?
Right. I think that's a very complicated question that I don't necessarily have the expertise to answer. However, I do have a Discord server which has a channel in which teachers are discussing this very option, because they need to talk to their students about racism, and they are not necessarily keen on always doing it in this very specific theoretical way. So if the person who asked that question wanted to email me and be connected to my Discord server and speak to other teachers about this, I think they'd be in a much better position to advise.
Thank you. So can you comment on the idea that two different people can experience essentially the same thing, but feel it in totally different ways?
Yeah, I think this is part of the problem with going with experiential knowledge, and this is the importance of the methods of science. When we need to actually know if something is true, then we need to sort of account for precisely this kind of difference, that people can experience things differently, and that we need to know what is actually happening by trying to remove as many of the variables as we can that can lead to different truth claims. The fact that people experience things differently is just a factor of being human. Somebody could experience having a disabling medical condition or something as being absolutely devastating to their life, while somebody else could kind of power through it and find some kind of strength in overcoming it or whatever. We all have such different experiences that I don't think that is a bad thing, and it doesn't present any kind of threat to objective truth. That's just the messiness of being human.
A question about somebody who has seen that people are telling him that the global geopolitical system has recently started taking a lot of right turns, projectionism of social controllers and mechanisms of control in issues of race, sex, religion, and economy. So the question is, in your experience and study, do you think this is true? And if so, can you say why this is happening, even though it appears that individual human life is being valued more and more across the globe? And if not, how can you tell your friends that they're full of it?
I think I think the center of that was is there a surge to sort of right-wing populist yes. leaders, and if that was, then yeah, I think this is undeniable. I'm sure there are a variety of reasons for this. I think Jonathan Haidt wrote well recently when there was the refugee crisis, and there was a sort of resurgence of populism and nationalism then, because there was a fear of cultural clash. And this, I think, Karen Stenner described as the authoritarian button, when people just suddenly become very sort of insular and authoritarian. So I think that I'm not the best person to speak on a global scale of geopolitics, but I think that the surge rightwards is quite a lot to do with the changing political landscape, with the troubles that are happening in the East. And I think more within Europe and within the Anglosphere, a surge towards the right is at least somewhat influenced by the declining credibility of the left due to critical social justice ideas. This is something that we are particularly worried about, and that we talk about in the book, which is that I don't think critical social justice can win. It cannot become a dominant ideology, but my concern is that what will push it back is going to be a kind of right-wing populism that could take with it genuine advances in gender, racial and LGBT equality. So I think it's happening. I think we need a liberal centre, really, to try to prevent that from happening. I don't think your friends are full of shit, but they may not be diagnosing the cause of it correctly.
Thank you. Okay, are you hopeful or cynical about the future prospects of liberalism?
I'm hopeful for the long-term prospects. I have to be, really. I'm a humanist. I'm an optimist. I think this works best for people. I don't think we're going to forget it, but I think we need to work at that. Liberalism, that weird societies, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. We are a new and unusual thing, and liberalism is a result of a certain amount of security. If we lose that security, if we lose that commitment to liberalism, it may not arise again. I think it's something that it's really important to hold on to and to learn to defend. So I'm optimistic that we can. I think as we start to lose liberalism, more and more people will realize how much they don't want to lose it. It's happened now. It can't disappear. I think people will fight for it, but I'm more worried about the near future. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. One of the criticisms of the woke is that they won't engage in debate. People have dedicated significant amount of time to examining your arguments. People like Donovan Irvin and Aaron Rabinowitz had discussions with you. But there seems to have been limited engagement between the people on either side of this argument. Do you have any ideas as to why?
I think there's a lack of communication from people who are really ideologically closed, yes. And even when there are certain groups who will discuss at length, I mean, libertarians and Marxists, for example, are united in the giving loads of homework and explaining everything to you in great detail. So I think, yeah, we have a problem where people will either not engage, they will just decide that you are clearly evil and or cynically motivated or financially motivated, and there's no point in talking to you. or there are people who will talk past each other. So my thoughts that I was talking to Gus about earlier about ideological theory of mind and trying to break down some of those barriers and find a bridge it's one way of crossing this, but I don't think we are in the right situation for it at the moment. I'm getting more concerned about how social media is affecting us. It sort of incentivizes sniping at people in one or two sentences and then blocking them or engaging in this way. So there are sort of forums like Letter, which I have a lot of respect for, and I'm trying to use more, where people can come together and talk about their very different ideas. But we really need people to want to do this, and I think that's the problem at the moment, is that too many of them don't.
Thank you. I think at this point I'll turn it over to Rohit to close up.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Shauna. And thank you to everybody who asked a question. And thank you to Helen for answering those questions. I hope whoever asked a question got an answer that they were satisfied with. So
I think quite a lot. Sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I think a lot of the questions were quite broad and that I didn't necessarily have the expertise for. So people can always write to me if they want to explain more or they feel I didn't explain.
Sounds good. And in the chat window, everyone should have received a list of links to Helen's work as well as ways to get in touch with her. I believe Twitter is the main one that's mentioned, but if you're okay with that, Helen, or if you want, you can also mention your email address if you're comfortable with it, or type it in the chat window and I can forward that. But I think Twitter is probably the best way to get in touch with you unless you think otherwise.
I miss a lot on Twitter because I get so many. So, but my email is there in the top. So anybody who needs any help with anything quite urgently, you can find me.
Okay, excellent. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed today's talk. I would like to thank Helen and Gus for being so generous with their time and their knowledge. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are Canada's only national nonprofit for science and free thought. And while donations are extremely helpful, we really value memberships. As a member, you not only get access to these great events, but more importantly, you join a movement with over 300 members where our voices of reason get stronger and more influential. As we grow in numbers, so does our influence with government decision makers and the public opinion that guides them. We advocate for evidence-based decisions on government policy, healthcare, public education, and human rights. If concerns like climate change, blasphemy laws, education curriculums, medical pseudoscience are important to you, please become a CFIC member. You can purchase a membership from our website at centerforinquiry.ca. And in the chat window, I've also posted links to our website to become a member. As well, if you want to volunteer with CFIC, you can sign up on our website as well, and there's many open positions for you to choose from. So you can come with certain skill sets that you think would be beneficial to us, or you can just come and we can find something that we have a need for. You can also see a calendar where we have our upcoming events, as well as a link to our YouTube page where you can see our previous events. And that's all posted in the chat window. And with that, I would like to thank once again Helen and Gus, and I want to thank everybody and have a great weekend, and we'll see you again at the next event. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Helen and Gus. Bye.
Bye.